Vatican Assassins, Chapter 36, the Jesuits, 1913 to 1936. The Pope's private banking monopoly, the Federal Reserve System, financing Rome's crusades, the communist graduated income tax, the Pope's tax collectors, the Inquisitional Internal Revenue Service, Archbishop of Baltimore, James Cardinal Gibbons, the American Pope, assassination of Pennsylvania Congressman Louis T. McFadden. The Jesuits compose a society, an ever-active and almost omnipresent instrument of papal despotism, the secret, insinuating, but ever watchful and vigilant foe to freedom, civil or religious, and to the pure, unadulterated gospel of Christ. John Dowling, 1845. The immense wealth of the Jesuits has been bequeathed to them by wills made at the last hour. G.B. Niccolini, Rome, 1889. The Jesuit, on the contrary, has always been clamorous for power and wealth, and has in consequence occupied himself both individually and collectively with the rich rather than the poor. M.F. Cusack, 1896. The American people must be very blind indeed if they do not see that if they do nothing to prevent it, that day is very near when the Jesuits will rule their country. They're already the masters of New York City through Archbishop Michael Corrigan, Charles Chiniquy, 1886. The houses of profession were for Jesuits of the first order who could hold no property but were dependent on charity. The houses of residence or probation were for those of the second order who could hold any amount. Many of these houses are said to have equaled in splendor the palaces of the kings and princes of France. A late writer says, at the abolition of this order, their property was found to exceed 10 times the papal treasury at its most flourishing and affluent period, and yet no money scarcely was found in their establishment, owing no doubt to that precaution secreted for future purposes. Aloysium Giustiniani, 1843. It is an established fact that after the Dutch, the Jesuits carry on the most extensive and most valuable trade with East India. On this account, in Surat, Agra, and Goa, or wherever else they may establish a domicile, they're taken for what they profess to be, namely merchants. I know, however, that they are Jesuits, and deeply initiated too, in the knowledge of even the closest secrets. It is moreover evident that they have been selected from different nations, and they are even Armenians and Turks. Now, the Saud and Bin Laden dynasties, who devote themselves purely to the interest of the Society of Jesus, they thus obtain by their trade truly measurable advantages for their society, and the credit they enjoy is still further marvelous. As to all appearance, they are not at all inspected and keep accounts with no one as some fathers do, those in disguise. Besides the ordinary vow of obedience, are required to take a still more strict oath that they never will betray anything to anyone who is not initiated, and on the other hand, they will strive with their utmost endeavor for the profit and gain of the society, in order that there can never take place any interchange between the initiated and the uninitiated. A secret Masonic sign has to be given which must be recognized, and in this way everyone knows whether he has a brother before him or not. Meanwhile, however important and considerable this kind of trade was, the Jesuits knew how to keep it secret, and thereby brought it about that no one troubled himself about it. In this book is a culmination of my efforts against Jesuits and Jesuitism, for the Roman Catholic hierarchy is today Jesuitized. The Vatican looks to America. The Vatican is coming to look more and more toward America as the Catholic stronghold. The wonderful strides of the Church in the United States has not only been a source of keen gratification to Pope Pius X, but has led the Curia to believe that the New World offers more possibilities than the old, having expelled the Jesuits from nearly all of Europe and Tsarist Russia. Mr. Ryan is very much persona grata at the Vatican. He's in intimate touch with the financial affairs of the Roman Catholic Church, and it is predicted that it is only a matter of short time until he, or rather his banking house, will have carte blanche with the vast funds of the Church. You doubtless remember who Thomas F. Fortune Ryan is. You can doubtless recall some of his unsavory record. His career as the looter of the traction lines in New York City, the looter of the Seaboard Airline Railway, the corrupt of courts and legislator, The purchase of political nominations and the debauchery of Virginia politics smelts to heaven. Dear truth seeker, Thomas F. Ryan was a powerful knight of Columbus who diligently served the Bishop of Richmond, Virginia, Augustine van der Weyer, having been consecrated to his bishopric by none other than Baltimore's American Pope James Cardinal Gibbons. Residents of New York City, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Ryan, donated the new Sacred Heart Cathedral with furnishings at a cost of nearly $500,000, in addition to subsequent churches, schools, and convents in the Richmond area. Rome's quest of Catholicizing the very heart of the old Protestant and Baptist Calvinist South was in full swing. Tammany Hall is a Catholic organization from which arose New York Governor Alfred E. Smith, who later backed the FDR for presidency in 1932, organized for political plunder and dividing the loot with the priests. Ryan is the master of Tammany also, and this was what gave him immunity from punishment while he was robbing the people through extraction deals. If he becomes the Pope's financial agent, secretly in collusion with the Masonic financial houses of Morgan and Rockefeller, with the almost unlimited financial resources of Rome at his disposal, finally to be consolidated in the Federal Reserve System branch, Bank of New York, the campaign for political control of America by the Italian hierarchy will begin in earnest, which political control at the time of his writing, 1912, had already been achieved. For years and years, the American priesthood had been preparing the minds of the people to take orders from Rome on matters political. For years and years, they have been concentrating their energies on America. For years and years, they have been steadily advancing on New York City and Washington City, two strategic points of the greatest importance. New York hosting the order's most important branch of Federal Reserve Bank, and Washington, D.C. hosting the temple of the order's Federal Reserve Board. From the city of New York, the business world is controlled. From the great metropolis issue the magazines and the newspapers of the largest circulation. From that city of transportation, companies are controlled. He who rules in New York is the king of this nation, at which time is the Archbishop of New York, Edward Cardinal Egan, whose keynote speaker at the 2006 annual Alfred E. Smith dinner at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel was the crypto-Roman Catholic Episcopalian CFR member Republican John S. McCain III. The financial interests of that city dominate those of all others. Wall Street expends and contracts the currency, precipitates panics and checks them, as did the Masonic crypto-Roman Catholic Episcopalian J.P. Morgan in 1907, thus justifying the aforeplanned congressional promotion of a Marxist central bank with full credit monopoly. Dictates governmental policies, overawes administrations, beats Congress into submission to its will, uses the National Treasury as a branch bank of its own, compels the government to withdraw from circulation 150 million of its own gold, gets another mortgage of the Republic whenever it needs one in its business, then restoring the Pope's temporal power, and upon occasion can practically suspend the circulation of the nation's own money, fully removing silver certificates and silver coin from circulation with crypto-Catholic LBJ, sent prices and fortunes crashing downward, later to be experienced by the American people with the stock market crash of 1929, caused by three Irish Catholic short tellers, Tom Bragg, Ben Smith, and Joe Kennedy. While the President of the United States, the offices of the law, the Army, and the Navy, all controlled today by the Orders Council of Foreign Relations, CFR, and a nation of nearly 100 million people look helplessly on. With the colossal riches of the Roman Catholic Church at his command, secretly wielded by Freemason J.P. Morgan, Thomas F. Ryan could absolutely dominate New York and Wall Street, and through the instrumentalities already indicated, controlled American commerce, American politics, American legislation, American politics at home and abroad, and worst of all, poisoned the American mind. Thomas E. Watson, 1912. The actual ruler of this nation lives not in the White House of Washington, but in the Palace of Baltimore. James Cardinal Gibbons. No important editorial affecting the Romish Church is printed until it has been submitted to the Cardinal for his criticism. We wonder at the power exercised. No member of Congress enters Washington, but he's weighed in the Romish balances. If he comes down with the shekels for the church and with votes for her policy, all is well. If not, there is a reckoning time to come, and an invisible influence is exerted at once that touches the springs of power and is far away home via secret societies. As a political machine, Rome is a transcendent success, and the Jesuit was more than half right when he said the domestic representative of the Pope in the Vatican, who until 1921 was the Archbishop of Baltimore, is the ruler of the United States of America. Justin D. Fulton, 1888. We are in immediate danger in this country of becoming subservient to a foreign potentate whose throne is on the banks of the far-off Tiber. The Pope of Rome claims the right to hold and exercise temporal power wheresoever he can secure it. To the ends thereof, his entire hierarchy is subject to his will and command. The most powerful organization at his disposal is bound by oath to subvert the constitution and laws of all countries to the word of the Pope. In this, the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States may thank themselves for the most compact and determined organization ever founded to withstand it. The political machinery of that church. Scott F. Hershey, 1894. You know what happens when you're a servant of a corporation. You have in no instance access to the men who are really determining the policy of the corporation. 14th Amendment, America, via Pope CFR. It is true that while most men are thus submerged into the corporation, a few and very few are exalted to a power which as individuals they could never have wielded. Through the great organizations of which they are the heads, a few are enabled to play a part unprecedented by anything in history in the control of the business operations of the country and in the determination of the happiness of great numbers of people. Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture, J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, afraid of somebody, are afraid of something, as was Woodrow Wilson. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. They know that 14th Amendment corporate fascist America is not a place of which it can be said as it is used to be during the old Union 1787 to 1868, that a man may choose his own calling and pursue it just as far as his abilities enable him to pursue it. Because today, if he enters certain fields, there are organizations which will use means right against him that will prevent his building up a business which they do not want to have built up. Organizations that will see to it that the ground is cut from under him and the market shut against him. There has come over the land that un-American set of conditions which enables a small number of men who control the government to get favors from the government, by those favors to exclude their fellows from equal business opportunity, by those favors to extend a network of control that will presently dominate every industry in the country. I speak for the moment of the control of the government exercised by big business. Behind the whole subject, of course, is the truth that in the New World Order, government and business must be associated closely, i.e. Jesuit corporate fascism, an invisible empire has been set up above the forms of democracy. The masters of the government of the United States are the combined cartel capitalists and manufacturers of the United States. The big bankers, the big manufacturers, the big masters of commerce, the heads of railroad corporations and of steamship corporations, that by agreements handed around among themselves they control prices, and that the same group of men control the larger credits of the country. There's hardly a part of the United States where men are not aware that secret private purposes and interests have been running the government. They have been running it through the agency of those interesting persons called political bosses. We may delude ourselves with the pleasing belief that we are electing our own officials, but of course, the fact is we are merely making an indifferent and ineffectual choice between two sets of men, nominally opposing each other, but actually working in perfect understanding and cooperation, named by interests which are not ours. Woodrow Wilson, 1913. The real menace of the republic is the invisible government which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over the city, state, and nation. Like the octopus of real life, it operates on the cover of a self-created screen. It seizes in its long and powerful tentacles our executive offices, our legislative bodies, our schools, our courts, our newspapers, our every agency created for the public protection. It squirms in the jaws of darkness, and thus is the better able to clutch the reins of government, secure enactment of the legislation favorable to corrupt business, violate the law of impunity, smother the press, and reach into the courts. To depart from mere generalizations, let me say, at the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests and a small group of powerful banking houses, generally referred to as the international bankers. The little coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government via the CFR for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both political parties with political platforms, make catspaws of party leaders, use the leading men in private organizations, and resort to every device to place a nomination for high public office. Only such candidates as will be amenable to the dictates of corrupt big business. They connive at the centralization of government on the theory that a small group of hand-picked, privately controlled individuals in power can be more easily handled than a larger group among whom there will most likely be men's sincere interest in public welfare. These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and magazines in this country. They use the columns of these papers to club into submission or drive out the office public officials who refuse to do the bidding of the powerful corrupt cliques which compose the invisible government. The author of the above quote was one such person under the total control of Rome, John F. Hyland, 1868 to 1936. Irish Roman Catholic American who obtained a law degree from New York Law School in 1897. A Democrat and backed by New York City's Tammany Hall, Hyland became a two-term mayor of New York City, 1918 to 1925. Thus, Hyland was the other pawn of Archbishop Patrick Hayes, overseen by the orders nearby Fordham University. He was well acquainted with the Knight of Columbus, Nicholas Brady, and was backed by media giant Freemason William Randolph Hearst. Hyland's propaganda was the identical Jesuit rhetoric as championed by the orders Rockefeller-funded John Birch Society. Blamed the Rockefellers and international bankers for the deeds of the Society of Jesus. John F. Hyland, March 27, 1922. The hatred which Europe once manifested toward a central ecclesiastical power is fast disappearing. There will be a general agreement to exalt Rome. The wealth of all nations is about to be given into her hands. The United States government will place the unbounded resources of this country into the hands of the same power. A central bank always imposes a tremendous burden on the nation for rearmament and defense in order to create inextinguishable debt, creating a military dictatorship, enslaving the people to pay the interest on the debt via the fraudulent income tax on wages first put upon Americans as WW2 Victory Tax of 1942, which the bankers have artificially created. H.W. Lux denounced the Federal Reserve Act and the Great Conspiracy of the House of Morgan, 1916. In the Federal Reserve law, they have wrested from the people and secured for themselves the constitutional power to issue money and regulate the value thereof. The House of Morgan, in submission to the Jesuits ruling New York City, is now in supreme control of our industry, commerce, and political affairs. They are in complete control on the policy making of the Democratic, Republican, and Progressive parties. Representing the New York Federal Reserve District on the First Federal Advisory Council was J.P. Morgan Jr. He was named chairman of the Executive Committee. Thus, Paul Warburg and J.P. Morgan Jr. sat in conference at the meetings of the Federal Reserve Board during the first years of its operation, surrounded by the other governors and members of the council who could hardly have been unaware that their futures would be guided by these two powerful bankers. The Morgan control of the Federal Reserve System is exercised through control of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Citicorp, Morgan's First National Bank of New York, merged with National City Bank in 1955. Chase Manhattan, Chase and the Bank of Manhattan merged. The Rockefeller and Kuhn Loeb Group, Chemical Bank of New York. These are the banks which bought the first issue of the Federal Reserve Bank stock in 1914. Jerusalem will be given to the Holy See. Said that Italy will take Holy Land and present it to the Vatican for properties taken by the state in 1817 by King Victor Emmanuel II. Chicago, October 12, that Italy will not make peace with Turkey until it has wrested Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim sovereignty and presented it to the Pope as a papal state, is the statement of L'Italia, an Italian newspaper of Chicago, edited by Oscar Durante. Several columns of the first page of the paper, which will be issued tomorrow, are devoted to editorials and news items, the burden of which is that Italy will demand the cessation of Jerusalem and the Holy Land as identification for the expenses incurred in the war with Turkey over Tripoli, later to be accomplished by the British in 1917, that the Holy Land will be presented to the Pope, thus resorting to him temporal power, evidencing the intent of the Pope to exercise his restored temporal power from Jerusalem, that this will bring out a reconciliation between the Vatican and the Quirinal, bringing to an end self-imposed retirement of the Holy Father, since the Papal States in Italy were rightly seized by the Italian government in 1870 by Freemason King Victor Emmanuel II. That for the first time since the days of the Crusades, the cross will replace the crescent in the land most sacred to those professing the Christian Roman Catholic religion. The news item on which the articles are based comes as a special cablegram from a correspondent who for years is said to have had especially good sources of information in the Vatican. Under the heading, Italy is to redeem the Holy Land. It will make a gift of it to the head of Christendom, the Pope. L'Italia will say how a protectorate of Tripoli and an offer of indemnity no longer will satisfy Italy, but complete annexation and reimbursement of war expenses incurred to the present will be demanded. Following this appears a telegram from Arturo Scetti, L'Italia's correspondent in Rome, which reads as follows: I am in a position to communicate a very important fact, learned through a personage high in Vatican diplomacy, Cardinal Secretary of State. Besides conquering Tripoli, Italy is planning to take possession of the city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and to present it to a Holy See to be held under the protectorate of the Italian government, Masonic King Victor Emmanuel III, being secretly subject to Rome. Oscar Durante, 1911. The responsibility for the security of my country forces me to measures of defense. I have gone to the extreme limit of the possible in my efforts for the preservation of the peace of the world. It is not I who bear the responsibility for the misfortune which now threatens the entire civilized world. It rests in your Tsar Nicholas II's hand to avert it. If the Tsar's order for military mobilization of 14 million Russian soldiers on the borders of Austria and Germany can no longer be retracted, which is not true, why then did the Tsar Nicholas II, cousin of King George V, appeal to my mediation 3 days afterward without mention of the issuance of the mobilization order? Frivolity and weakness are to plunge the world into the most frightful war, which eventually aims at the destruction of Protestant Germany. For I have no doubt left about it. England, Russia, and France have agreed among themselves to take the Austro-Serbian conflict for an excuse for waging a war of extermination against us. That is the real naked situation in nous in embryo, and cleverly set going certainly by Edward VII, who readmitted the Jesuits into Great Britain in 1902, has been carried on and systematically systematically built up by the disowned conferences between England and Paris. And St. Petersburg finally brought a conclusion by George V, advised by Jesuit Bernard Vaughan, and set to work. So the famous circumscription of Germany has finally become a complete fact, despite every effort of our politicians and diplomats to prevent it. The net has been suddenly thrown over our head, and England sneeringly reaps the most brilliant success of a persistently prosecuted, purely anti-German world policy against which we have proved ourselves helpless, while she twists the noose of our political and economic destruction out of our fidelity to Austria, as we squirm isolated in the net, a great achievement which arouses the admiration even of him who is to be destroyed as its result. The whole war is plainly arranged between England, France, and Russia for the annihilation of Germany, to be completed with Hitler's WW2. Lastly, through the conversations with Jesuit-controlled Raymond Poincaré in Paris and Petersburg, and the Austro-Serbian strife is only an excuse to fall upon us. God help us in this fight for existence, brought about by falseness, lies, and poisonous envy. Sir George Buchanan was the English ambassador to Russia at the time of the revolution. In his book, My Mission in Moscow, he spent 16 pages defending himself against charges that he and the English government were responsible for the March Revolution and the death of the Tsar. After World War I, that accusation was made by a number of knowledgeable observers, but strangely it is never mentioned today. Why? Is it because there's a conscious effort via the Orders, Rockefeller financed Masonic John Birch Society to convince us that Jacob Schiff alone financed the Bolshevik Revolution? Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Masonic Lord Alfred Milner sent Bruce Locker to Russia as his personal envoy. In his book, British Agent R.H. Bruce Locker writes, another new acquaintance of these first days in the Bolshevik St. Petersburg was Raymond Robbins, the head of the American Red Cross mission. Although a rich man himself, he was an anti-capitalist, but like Masons, Rockefeller and Morgan was a cartel capitalist. Hitherto, his two heroes had been Mason Theodore Roosevelt and Mason Cecil Rhodes. Now Mason Lenin had captured his imagination. Robbins was the only man whom Lenin was always willing to see, and whoever succeeded in imposing his own personality on the unemotional Bolshevik leader. Raymond Robbins represented William Boyce Thompson of the Federal Reserve Bank. Mason, Colonel House, and Mason J.P. Morgan Jr. Bruce Locker noted that he and Robbins were invited to Bolshevik executive committee meetings and consulted on important decisions. In his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin wrote, the Bolsheviks were well aware of the power these men represented, and there was no door closed to them. They were allowed to attend meetings of Central Executive Committee and were consulted regarding important decisions. Isn't it strange that an Englishman and an American were invited to attend such important meetings? Raymond Robbins worked for William Boyce Thompson, who was a member of the Federal Reserve Board when Anthony C. Sutton researched the State Department intelligence files. He found several references to the fact that William Boyce Thompson gave Lenin $1 million. In addition, he found that Lenin nationalized every bank in Russia except the Rockefeller-controlled National City Bank, which remained open and continued to provide funds for the Bolsheviks, even as Rockefeller's Chase Branch Bank in Paris, under the direction of Vice President for European Affairs Nazi Malta Joseph J. Larkin, remained open during the Nazi occupation of France. With the 1940 Hitler-Petain armistice, eliminating legal French resistance to Hitler, and Rockefeller's Knights of Malta directed Chase Bank financing the Nazis, Petain's Vichy government could then work with the Black Pope's Gestapo in fulfilling the Council of Trent. Hitler then excused the Jesuits from military service. In 1941, while Petain readmitted the society into France, in 1942, removing all hindrances to the orders, intended consequences of Rockefeller-Morgan financed Nazi fascism. Where did the Bolsheviks get the food and medical supplies they needed to consolidate their control over Russia? Subsequent 1921 CFR member Herbert Hoover headed the American Relief Mission following World War I. On May 28, 1919, he wrote to President Wilson, "As a result of the Bolshevik economic conceptions, the people of Russia are dying of hunger and disease at the rate of some hundreds of thousands monthly in a country that formerly supplied food to a large part of the world. The risen Son of God using Satan's Jesuits to starve the accursed and heretic Orthodox Russian peoples for participating in the orders. Many pogroms against the Jews. The Bolsheviks had resorted to terror, bloodshed and murder to a degree long since abandoned even amongst reactionary tyrannies, as that organized Checa murder was in fact a Jesuit inquisition." At that time, Lenin and his followers held only a small area. The remainder of the country was under the control of those who wanted to restore freedom to the Russian people. Considering the brutality and inhumanity of the Bolsheviks, you would think that most of our relief supplies would have been sent to the anti-communists, but that was not the case. Herbert Hoover cataloged the destination of the food and medical supplies we sent to Russia in 1922. Food, clothing, and medical supplies, 27,588 tons sent to the areas controlled by the anti-communists. 740,571 tons sent to the areas controlled by the Bolsheviks. Charity from the United States, $332,508 thousand sent to the areas controlled by the anti-communists. $55,994,588 sent to the areas controlled by the Bolsheviks. Those figures dwarf the 20 million Jacob Schiff supposedly sent to the Bolsheviks, yet Herbert Hoover's statistics are never mentioned today, lest their financing be traced back to Wall Street's Gentile Knights of Malta and High Freemasons administering the company's Federal Reserve Bank. In order to facilitate trade, the Bolsheviks needed an international bank. They selected several former Tsarist bankers and representatives from Masonic German, Swedish, and American banks to serve on their board of directors. Funds for the Soviet bank came from Montagu Norman's Bank of England, and the director of the Foreign Exchange Division of the Bolshevik Bank was Max May, a vice president of Guarantee Trust Company, a JP Morgan bank. Thus, we find that British and American bankers largely controlled the Bolshevik central bank. Knight of Malta and CFR member Martin F. Shee would later be the executive vice president of Morgan Bank. From the Morgan Bank's New York City headquarters, italics links the U.S. branch or tongue of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the SMOM headquarters in Rome. Knight of Malta and CFR member Francis X. Stankard would direct Masonic David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. Also New York City, Notre Dame President F.R. Theodore M. Hesburgh would be a director Chase and the chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. The city's archbishop would rule over the American tongue of the Knights of Malta from the order's headquarters at St. Patrick's Cathedral, adjacent to Rockefeller Center, controlling the nation's press via the CFR with its enforcer, the CIA, at the behest and decrees of the archbishop. With total control of both the Rockefeller and Morgan financial empires since the presidency of Theodore Rex Roosevelt, the 20th century was indeed the American century, the Black Popes directing both Soviet communism and Nazi fascism into the crucible of his greatest of all papal crusades to date, the Second 30 Years' War, 1914 to 1945. General Peter Wrangel led the White Russian Army in southern Russia. His forces were defeating the Bolsheviks until British agents ordered him to withdraw his army to the Black Sea and leave Russia. He was told that if he refused, they would cut off his source of supplies and his men would perish. English agents destroyed the airplanes he had purchased, and eventually General Wrangel was forced to abandon his effort to free Russia. Admiral Alexander Kolchak led the anti-communist army on the Eastern Front. He too was defeating the Bolsheviks until his supplies were cut off by the British and American financiers who had been financing him. Once the banks had extracted the economic concessions they wanted from Lenin, they stopped supporting his enemy. In his 3-volume set, Western technology and Soviet economic development, Anthony Sutton documented the fact that Russian communism has been financed by Western banks and Western corporations since its inception. In his book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, he documented the fact that Rockefeller and Morgan banks provided the Bolsheviks with loans, while American industry provided them with the plants and the technology they needed. Westinghouse, 33rd degree Freemason Henry Ford, Skull and Bonesman, CFR member, FDR's ambassador to Stalin's Moscow, Averell Harriman, CFR member, Masonic Jewish Zionist Armand Hammer, Rockefeller's Exxon, and other American firms built the infrastructure that allowed the Soviet Union to survive. The same thing is happening today. In 1983, John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, told the graduating class of Annapolis, "Within weeks, many of you will be looking across just hundreds of feet of water at some of the most modern technology ever invented in America. Unfortunately, it's on Soviet ships." In 1982, William Armstrong addressed the United States Senate and said America's budgetary woes would not be nearly so severe if our economy were not groaning under the strain of financing two military budgets, our own and a significant portion of the Soviet Union's. It is difficult to overstate the extent to which the West has contributed to the military threat that now endangers our very existence. As I noted earlier, most Jewish banks are controlled by those associated with either the Round Table, now the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or its American counterpart, the Council on Foreign Relations. Did Jacob Schiff really give the Bolsheviks $20 million? I haven't been able to document he did, but I can document the fact that the major founding for the Bolsheviks came from non-Jewish sources, i.e. the white Gentile Rockefeller and Morgan banks of New York, directing the Black Pope's Federal Reserve Bank and London's Gentile-ruled Bank of England. For it is the times of the Gentiles, Luke 21:24. There are those who would like us to believe that Zionism is the primary source behind the effort to establish a world government, i.e. the orders Communist Manifesto attributed to Masonic Jew and hater of the beloved Hebrew/Jewish/Israelitic people Karl Marx, the French Jesuits, secretly authored the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Father Bernard Stamford's Mein Kampf, Masonic Henry Ford's Jesuit ghostwritten The International Jew, the Jesuit Order's periodical Civiltà Cattolica of the late 19th century, etc. It is not. In the particular international situation at present confronting us, the leading international banking house is J.P. Morgan & Co., the most dominant banking influence today in the world. This control of the world business structure and a human happiness to progress by a small group is a matter of the most intense public interest. In analyzing it, we must begin with the international group, which centers itself around J.P. Morgan & Co. Never before in the history of the world has there been such a powerful centralized control over finance, industrial production, credit, and wages as is at this time vested in the Morgan Group. The Morgan interest is able to exercise a high degree of control in international exchange, loans, and commerce due to the fact that the parent Morgan Company acts as a fiscal agent for Great Britain, France, Belgium, and Italy, all ruled by the Society of Jesus, is the dominating influence in the new bank for international settlements and is the most potential influence in the Federal Reserve System, which is virtually a pool of our national assets. The Morgan control of the Federal Reserve System is exercised through control of the management of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the mediocre representation and acquiescence of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. This international association of financial organizations under central control in Papal Rome marks a new epoch in world financial history and is the basis for the greatest danger free government has had to face in centuries since the dawn of the Reformation's modern era in 1648. The usurpation of authority had already gone far. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, with the permission of the Federal Reserve Board at Washington, has placed billions of dollars of credit at the disposal of Morgan and Rockefeller-owned New York banks to be loaned abroad by discounting foreign acceptances and permitting foreign loans of all kinds to be made without the authorizations of the United States Treasury. If the powers which is now exercising over credit in the United States are permitted or are to be permitted by statute, then it is within the discretion of the Federal Reserve Board, if it so chooses, to shift the entire monetary wealth of the American people to the uses of the foreigner, he being none other than the Black Pope. When Theodore Roosevelt ascended the presidency in the same year that Morgan created U.S. Steel, later to be headed by Knights of Malta Marion C. Taylor and John Farrell, public outcry made the chief question facing him the issue of the trusts. It was a political dilemma. Antitrust legislation, the new president declared, was about as effective as a papal bull against the comet. Morgan's steel trust, sprawled over the most basic modern industries, would be overlooked by Roosevelt's regulators and trust busters, as would his New England Railroad monopoly. But the most obvious sacrifice for which the public clamored was Masonic Jesuit temporal coadjutor John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Standard Oil. By midsummer of 1907, there were 7 federal suits pending against the Standard and its various subsidiaries. The most spectacular legal fireworks of the year came in the celebrated Judge Tennessee Mountain Landis case. The Landis decision was indeed overturned on appeal, but the Jesuit-controlled U.S. Department of Justice began a suit in Federal Circuit Court in Missouri, petitioning for the dissolution of the trust itself as a conspiracy in restraint of trade, a much lesser charge than extortion or price fixing. The government won the case and kept winning on the long road to appeal. It was on a chilly March day in 1911 that Jesuit temporal coadjutor, according to ex-priest Jeremiah J. Crowley, Chief Justice White of the Supreme Court, who received his law degree from Jesuit Georgetown University, rose to read the decision that finally dissolved the Standard Trust. After hearing the news, Rockefeller sent a humorous obituary to his old partners. Dearly beloved, we must obey the Jesuit orders. Supreme Court, our splendid, happy family must scatter. Rockefeller secretly working with Roosevelt's trust busters, giving the illusion that his trust was in fact destroyed. The octopus was broken down into 39 different and theoretically competitive companies at the time of dissolution, but ownership remained in the hands of the same shareholders who had always been in control, and for years the new firms would continue to respect each other's territorial imperatives, as does the Pope's Masonic Vatican hierarchy, the Pope's Masonic Mafia families, the Pope's Masonic intelligence agencies, and the Pope's Masonic banking families, both Jew and Gentile. The trust's life after death proved an ironic epilogue to the suit, for within a week after stockholders received their shares, the Standard companies were traded on Wall Street for the first time. It exploded in the biggest bull market yet known for a single stock, dramatically increasing the value of the former trust. Standard of New Jersey rose in worth from $260 per share to $580. Standard of Indiana from $3,500 to $9,500. Thus, while people were celebrating the breaking of the trust, another $200 million was added to the value of Standard stock in the space of 5 short months. President Roosevelt himself saw the irony of it all. In a 1912 speech, the same year the company sent the Titanic to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean, he pondered the results of trust busting and remarked, "No wonder that Wall Street prayer now is, "O merciful Providence, give us another dissolution." For David Rockefeller and his brothers, World War II was a step over the past, yet a scandal at its onset showed how far the family had come from the days when Standard Oil and Rockefeller were synonymous, and proved again the wisdom of Junior's decision to minimize public identification with the company, proven Jesuit military tactic of indirect control to a trusted third party. For as America was beginning to mobilize, Standard Oil was once again the subject of shocking revelations. In the 1920s, the Jersey Company had entered into a cartel with the German petrochemical monopoly IG Farben, later managed by Pope Pius XII's Roman Catholic Papal Knights, Otto Ambrose and Hermann Abs. The business relationship had continued even after Hitler's rise to power in 1941 on the eve of Pearl Harbor. The order in full control of Mason's Hirohito and FDR, thus the heads of both American and Japanese military intelligence, during hearings of the U.S. Senate Committee to investigate the National Defense, Assistant Attorney General Thurman Arnold read the letter from Standard Vice President Frank A. Howard, noting that the company had renewed the cartel agreement with the Nazis in Holland in 1939. The terms had seemed so distinctly lacking in patriotic concern that the openly committed chairman, who was in fact secretly loyal to Rome, Masonic Jesuit Temple Coadjutor Harry S. Truman, had left the room snorting, "I think this approaches treason." With memories of the Ivy League scandal in mind, Junior grew greatly concerned as the Truman Committee probed the intricacies of the Standard Farben cartel. By 1942, Farben was known to be operating with slave labor from the Nazi concentration camps. He privately requested a memorandum from Standard executives explaining their dealings with the Axis powers, which he could use in his defense, if it should come to that, but it never did. He had become a citizen above suspicion, just like Freemason Thomas J. Watson of IBM and Shriner Harry Truman obediently carried out the cover-up. Nothing more clearly reveals the role in which Jewish Freemason Paul Warburg was deliberately used by the papacy's white Gentile Masonic conspirators than their treatment of him after he had served this purpose. As soon as they had forced the British into submission and agreed to bring the U.S. into World War I to finance and fight it for the Allies, Warburg was ousted from their Federal Reserve, never to return to it, either directly or indirectly. He had served his role as a fall guy. In addition, there was his knowledge of central banking and the value as a Jew that would serve them well in distracting attention from their own Gentile malign role and in affording a scapegoat with the inflammatory value of Shylock and Jew, which Jesuit rhetoric was championed by Father Bernard Stamford's Mein Kampf, the continual diatribes of Masonic Adolf Hitler, and the eloquent speeches of Hitler's Jesuit-trained Roman Catholic Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels in blaming both German and American Masonic Jews secretly loyal to the papacy for bringing America into World War I and thus the destruction of Bismarck's Protestant Prussian Empire. The answer to the Kennedy assassination is with the Federal Reserve Bank. Don't underestimate it. It's wrong to blame it on the Knight of Malta James Angleton and the CIA directed by Knight of Malta John A. McCone per se only. This is only one finger of the same hand. The people who supply money are above the CIA. The clergy, the Jesuits, in order to increase or keep its riches, have always interfered with the political and economic life of the nation. The war industries offered a profitable investment. The previous help given by Morgan's Bank, the biggest bank in the world, had become the Holy See's power of attorney in America. In 1906, Masonic J. Pierpont Morgan vouchsafed a private tour of his art collection at 13 Princess Gate, the townhouse he inherited from his father, to Masonic King Edward, who readmitted the Jesuits into Great Britain in 1902. he had given the king financial advice, and the two often met at the European watering holes. His son-in-law Herbert Satterley noted a perfect equality between king and banker. They were just two friends together and seemed quite content to sit in silence sometimes and not try to entertain each other. As a coronation gift in 1901, Pierpont had given the king a $500,000 tapestry, which set off a long-lasting relationship between the House of Morgan and British royalty, both Masonic houses being subservient to the Black Pope. Even as apostate Episcopalian, Morgan aspired to heaven. He made religious men think in earthly terms. After 1905 audience, Pope Pius X breathed with regret. What a pity I did not think of asking Mr. Morgan to give us some advice about our finances. The House of Morgan would later advise the papacy on its purchases of American stocks. The House of Morgan was superbly positioned. Through its London and Paris houses, it had helped France finance the Franco-Prussian War and England with the Boer War, both wars having been incited by the Jesuits intending to extirpate Lutheran Prussians and Dutch Reformed Boers. In December 1913, President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, providing the government with a Marxian communist central bank and freeing it of the reliance on the House of Morgan in emergencies. The new Federal Reserve System was a hybrid institution with private regional reserve banks and a public Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Yet the House of Morgan moved so artfully to form an alliance with the Jesuit generals, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that for the next 20 years it would actually gain power from the new financial system. By early 1920, Jack Morgan, John P. Morgan, Jr., 1867 to 1943, had an almost inverted worldview. The rich struck him as impotent, the masses as all-powerful in the hands of demagogues. In this frightened state of mind, he hired a private detective, Irish Roman Catholic William Donovan, a New York City lawyer, and a highly decorated officer in World War I. Later known as Knight of Malta Wild Bill Donovan, he would head the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. Jack asked Donovan to investigate the Communist International, formed in 1919, which had singled out bankers as arch enemies of the working class, the order promoting the lie that communism was an enemy of the Pope's cartel capitalists who financed it. As a former banker to Tsar Nicholas II, Jack was watching the Bolsheviks with extra apprehension. On June 22, 1940, the new French Premier, Marshal Henry Philippe Pétain, who in 1942 readmitted the Jesuit order into France after over 40 years of expulsion, submitted to the Nazi blitzkrieg and signed an armistice with Hitler, leaving Britain to fight alone against the Axis powers. During the German occupation, 3 of the American banks with Paris branches, J.P. Morgan, Guaranty Trust, and Rockefeller's Chase National, stayed open, indicating that both Morgan and Rockefeller banks were in collusion with the occupying Nazi SS. In late June 1940, Leonard Rist, a Morgan & Company, was arrested and dispatched to a German prison camp in the Sudetenland. The House of Morgan finally sprang Leonard through their old Vatican friend Bernardino Nogara, the treasurer of the Special Administration of the Holy See. Pope Pius XII, German's confessor, Jesuit Robert Lieber, being the Black Pope's immediate master of Hitler's SS and Gestapo. The New York Times commented, the private banking house of J.P. Morgan & Co. gained a position of worldwide importance and a place in international financial affairs that not even the House of Rothschild attained in the period of its greatest power. But until after the Second World War, in February 1941, the Morgan office in Rome was closed, the papacy having planned the Nazi SS occupation of Rome in 1943 for the purpose of deporting the century-old Jewish ghetto in Auschwitz. 2 weeks later, the irresistible Giovanni Fiume popped up in London to supervise a secret transfer of Vatican gold bullion stored in a basement room at Morgan Grenfell to protect Vatican gold from German bombers. Throughout the 1930s, the Vatican had bought the gold at a fixed price of $35 an ounce, never selling any. Fiume would discreetly refer to it as a special commodity. For security reasons, the Vatican now decided to ship the gold to New York, teaching the observer that when the Vatican moves its gold out of a nation into another, there is an impending national crisis at hand in the nation. The wartime transfer was carried out under the official aegis of Roman Catholic Papal Knight Lord Halifax. Until recently, Britain's Foreign Secretary, the Jesuits bring in complete control of the American State Department and British Foreign Office via the CFR and the RIIA. The gold ended up at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. There it would dizzily appreciate in the post-war years. The recorded progress of our republic, material and spiritual in itself, proves the wisdom of the inherited policy of non-involvement in old world affairs. In accordance with George Washington's farewell address, we seek no part in directing the destinies of the old world. We do not mean to be entangled, but America, our America, the America builded on a foundation laid by the inspired fathers, can be party to no permanent military alliance. It can enter into no political commitments nor assume any economic obligations which will subject our decisions to any other than our own authority, including the King of England or the Pope of Rome. Every commitment must be made in the exercise of our national sovereignty. A world supergovernment, the League of Nations, is contrary to everything we cherish and can have no sanction by a republic, which speech sealed Harding's doom. The Harding poison murder case took 3 volumes of 350,000 words, index, illustrations, and court exhibits to prove that Harding was poisoned on the way to Alaska, then before arriving in Seattle, again on the train rushing down from Seattle, and finally in San Francisco. Strikingly close to the true timing of Harding's heart seizures and homeopathic Dr. Sawyer's over-application of purgatives, it may have been based on inside information, since it was assembled by a Harding administration Secret Service agent, former Burns Agency and FBI agent Walter Thayer, who had the support of Charity Remsburg, Harding's sister. While in the Secret Service, he worked on a $12 million counterfeit bond case and an inside job using treasury plates that had perhaps involved Gaston Means and Jess Smith, the homosexual companion of Irish Roman Catholic Jesuit Temple co-adjutant and Attorney General Harriam Daughtry. Thayer claimed that Harding was himself directing an investigation of the scam through Assistant Attorney General Charles Brewer. Harding died when Brewer was in San Francisco on this case. He further claimed that Secret Service Chief W.H. Moore had sent out a squad of their men to get something on Bureau of Investigation Chief and who was Superior William J. Burns. The Black Pope's Masonic J. Edgar Hoover said Thayer was mentally unbalanced and had all of his voluminous research and data destroyed. America's gold poor. There's nothing left in Fort Knox except junk gold. In 1934, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned over the nation's gold supply to the Federal Reserve System as a gift. By February 1929, the time of the Lateran Treaty, by which Mussolini restored the temporal power of the Pope, the Vatican state treasure had become an official fund, so that when Mussolini in the same year turned over 1,750 million lire, the equivalent at that time of $92 million, to the Vatican as a final settlement of the Roman question, Pope Pius XI, no less a good businessman than Benedict XV, invested most of his vast sum in America immediately after the market collapse in October 1929, caused by short seller Joe Kennedy. The move was a profitable one, for following the Great Depression of the 30s, 1929 to 1939, the church reaped colossal profits when the U.S. economy recovered via the FDR's Socialist Communist New Deal and newly created military-industrial complex, patronized by the U.S. Congress with the credit created by the Pope's privately owned cartel capitalist Federal Reserve Bank. Apart from the mutual communion of ideological and political interest between the Catholic Church and the U.S., one of the main reasons why the Vatican chose the U.S. as a depository and banker was that the Church there was already a billionaire, and that as such she commanded sufficiently authority in the monetary field to ensure that her interests were properly safeguarded. In 1952, Bishop McShay, for the papal representative, admitted purchase of gold by the Vatican. He added that a large number of papal ingots were held in the Federal Reserve vaults in New York. The celebrated House of the Rothschilds, who incidentally had been lending money to the Vatican since 1831, came once more to the fore with the buying, selling, and amalgamating millions of shares and other investments on behalf of the Vatican, as did Nathan Rothschild when in 1815, as an agent for the suppressed Jesuit order, he essentially bought London Stock Exchange, it having crashed due to the false report by Roast of Wellington's defeat at Waterloo. It is interesting to remember that the President of the French Republic, Mr. Georges Pompidou, for many years worked for the private bank de Paris of the Rothschilds. The Vatican, as we have already reiterated, has large investments with the Rothschilds of Britain, France, and America, with the Ambrose Bank, with the Credit Suisse in London and Zurich. In the United States, it has large investments with the Morgan Bank, with a telex directly to the Vatican, the Rockefeller Kuhn Loeb, Chase Manhattan Bank, the First National Bank of New York, the Bankers Trust Company, and others. The Vatican's treasure of solid gold has been estimated by the United Nations Wealth magazine to amount to several $1 billion. A large bulk of this is stored in gold ingots with the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, while banks in England and Switzerland hold the rest. But this is just a small portion of the wealth of the Catholic Church, which in the U.S. alone, as we have already seen, is greater than that of the 5 wealthiest giant corporations of the country. Only one concrete piece of information came out of this 1975 meeting between Hayman Krieger, Washington regional manager for the General Accounting Office, GAO, and 22-year Virginia Congressman J. Kenneth Robinson. Krieger admitted for the first time that Fort Knox and indeed the entire U.S. Treasury had been practically drained of pure gold. He confirmed the startling statement in a letter to Edward Durrell, a wealthy Ohio industrialist, dated April 11, 1975, saying that only 24.4 million ounces of the gold reserves of the United States remain. In other words, less than 10% of the 264 million ounces of so-called gold remaining could be considered good delivery gold, the only form acceptable in international trade. That means that 480 million ounces of pure gold has disappeared, 95% of our original stock between 1957 and 1972. Wild speculations abound, but the truth probably is that the government did not know how they would explain why the huge Central Core vault, measuring about 65 by 80 feet, was completely empty. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Gene E. Godley, was no doubt telling the truth. After many years of investigation, it now appears that the gold was shipped out of Fort Knox legally as part of something called the London Gold Pool, but it was certainly done without the full knowledge of or understanding by the general public, and the result, though technically legal as FDR had previously deeded the nation's gold to the Fed, was no less a crime against the people of the United States. The New York Assay Office scandal broke on December 21, 1978, when several newspapers published reports that more than 433 pounds of gold were missing from the Assay Office and that employees had been implicated in the theft. The New York Assay Office was an important transit point for America's gold stock. Of the 480 million ounces of pure gold which was lost between 1952 and 1972, the government acknowledged that 233,723,565 ounces of it was shipped from Fort Knox to New York. 90% of the U.S. Assay Office and the rest of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Just where the other 246,276,435 ounces of pure gold went remain unexplained. This gold belongs to the American people, not the Federal Reserve and their foreign friends and owners. Unfortunately, if one accepts the worst-case scenario that centralization of world gold reserves in Fort Knox was merely a plot to eventually transfer this gold into private hands in Europe, then shoddy accounting practices and government cover-ups would be a necessity. From the beginning, the Federal Reserve was implicated in nativist conspiracy theories, homespun tracts, and polemical books described it as a secret nexus for sinister forces in the world. The Fed was agent for the powers usually identified as the international bankers and sometimes the Illuminati or the Zionist conspiracy, echoing the febrile anti-Semitism associated with money since medieval Dark Age Christianity and Romanism. The Fed, it was said, was the operating center for a mysterious network of unseen but awesomely powerful people who were manipulating the society for their own purposes. World dominion. In the 1970s, as inflation accelerated, the dark theories about the Fed thrived anew, disseminated in scores of homemade newsletters and privately published books. When Paul Volcker was confirmed by the Senate Banking Committee in August 1979, a citizens group from Virginia had testified against him, noting his connections with the top secret Bilderberg Conference, David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. All of them staples in the popular theories of one world conspiracy, as indeed they are. In a twisted sense, belief in a grand conspiracy was an act of religious deference, an acknowledgement by people that someone or something held distant and unexplainable power over them. Somewhere in a hidden place, there were mortal men who conspired to rule over or to usurp powers that belonged only to God, as does the Pope. But the Federal Reserve did also function in the realm of religion. Its mysterious powers of money creation, worthless pieces of paper taking on value, inherited from priestly forebears. Rome's indulgences to sin also being worthless pieces of paper taken on value by the word of a money pope, shielded a complex bundle of social and psychological meanings. With its own form, a secret incantation, the Federal Reserve presided over awesome social ritual transactions so powerful and frightening they seem to lie beyond common understanding. Roman Catholic Jesuit trained temporal court Judas CFR speaker, former chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange, Richard F. Sion, a vice president of the Boston Fed and trustee of the Orders Boston College, who served for a time as a special assistant to Paul Volcker, suggested that the institutional temperament and structure of the Federal Reserve System most resembled the Catholic Church in which he had been raised, indicating that a Jesuit temporal court Judah must have overseen the construction of the Federal Reserve Act, that man being the cool lieutenant of J.P. Morgan's Skull and Bones, Henry P. Davison, who, according to Morgan's Thomas W. Lamont, another brother bonesman, served as the arbitrator of the Jekyll Island expedition. The system is just like the church. That's probably why I feel so comfortable with it. It's got a pope, the chairman, and a college of cardinals, the governors, and bank presidents, and a curia, the senior staff. The equivalent of the laity is the commercial banks. If you're naughty parishioner in the Catholic Church, you come to confession. In this system, if you're naughty, you come to the discount window for a loan. We even have different orders of religious thought, like Jesuits and Franciscans and Dominicans, only we call them pragmatists and monetarists and neo-Keynesians. Indeed, 1913 was a very good year, in the words of a Catholic mafioso nato morto Frank Sinatra, along with his sidekick, America's first black nato morto, Sammy Davis Jr., the Jesuits, using the cronies of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller Jr., sneaked through Congress the Federal Reserve Act during Christmas, bail mass, break on December the 23rd, 1913. That same year, the 16th Income Tax Amendment was declared to be ratified, and with the passing of the Internal Revenue Act, the order created a commercial inquisition. And why were these planks of the Communist Manifesto put in place? To finance the up-and-coming crusade, the Second 30 Years' War, to begin in 1914. This crusade would be financed just like the crusades of old. We read, in 1166 and again in 1188, the kings of England and France levied from their lay and clerical subjects to the support of a crusade, a tax assessed on their incomes, a crusade tax. The collectors appointed assessors who made the assessments themselves or on the oaths of the taxpayers themselves. Dear Truth Seeker, the Federal Reserve Bank is the American Empire's Vatican Central Bank, requiring a Social Security slave surveillance number for personal banking. The income tax, as Peter Pence attacks to finance the Vatican's crusades, they being World War I, World War II, and every conflict during and after the Cold War. That evil income tax was put upon American laborers in 1942 during World War II and was called the Victory Tax. That wicked Internal Revenue Service was unleashed upon a trusting public. The service, like the Inquisitor of the Dark Ages, demanding a full voluntary financial confession once a year at our own time and expense, for, in the words of John D. Rockefeller, it is a sin to make a profit. With the Jesuit generals, American empire in a continuous state of war. Since Truman's executive order of 1950, the 14th Amendment citizen must continue to pay his war tax, or it will be collected by force in the war courts. Flying the war flag of the empire's commander-in-chief to have more productivity for the Vatican's relentless war effort, the American subject/serf was given more daylight hours to perform his tasks. Therefore, in 1918 during World War I and again in 1942 during World War II, the Jesuits began daylight savings time, properly called wartime. When the hour arrives for the taxpayer to pay his war tax on his most sacred labor, he is either assessed by the IRS assessor priest or voluntarily assesses himself under oath, just as in the Dark Ages when Rome's priest, king, and papal Caesar was the theocratic universal monarch of the world. With these three planks in place, all the nation's businesses could now be monitored and regulated by the board of governors of a private corporation, the King's Bank. This corporation would never file a tax return, nor would it ever be audited. Ultimately, every person having income would have to file a return, making a confession of every Federal Reserve note earned and every Federal Reserve note spent in itemizing deductions. Federal Reserve notes are not dollars or lawful money, but rather compose a private corporate currency, which is in fact a fiat money, yet by an act of Congress a legal tender. backed by nothing except the confidence, or rather the faith of the people. This makes Federal Reserve notes identical to the historic paper currency of the Roman Catholic Church, and not a private corporation called indulgences. All good confessions to the priests of the Internal Revenue Service must be made no later than the anniversary date commemorating Rome's destruction of George Washington's Calvinistic Confederate Republic of Sovereign States, the Federal Republic of the United States of America. The date on which the Jesuits instigated their criminal war of northern aggression with the Federalist Radical Red/Black Republican Party, that date of infamy was April the 15th. Indeed, that Jesuit general's 14th Amendment, Holy Roman American Empire is the Pope's warhorse, extending the Pope's temporal power around the world while enforcing the Pope's Council of Trent. And woe be to the Pope's 14th Amendment Roman citizen who refuses to fight the Pope's wars. Every war since Archbishop James Cardinal Gibbon's Spanish-American War of 1898, who refuses to participate in the Pope's war crimes, mass murdering heretics, liberals, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and pagans, who refuses to pay the Pope's war tax, the income tax, in support of the Pope's war debt, the national debt, which is now impossible to repay, and should never be paid, to the fraudulent money creation of the Church of the Federal Reserve, who refuses to be identified with the Pope's war number. The socialist national credit system as money, put in circulation as a result of the creation of debt/credit rather than the honest creation of capital profit, the successful economic golden mean between land and labor, who refuses to live by the Pope's wartime daylight savings time, even as all the German Protestant Amish people refuse to turn their clocks back, who refuses to use the Pope's war courts, both federal and state courts, the Amish and Mennonites refusing to do so to this day, who refuses to use the Pope's war name given to him by the Pope's war courts, a proper name spelled with all capital letters, which nom de guerre is used by the federal courts in all actions, civil and criminal, and who refuses to submit to the personal jurisdiction of the Pope's war courts using a statutory statement or any other procedure challenging the court's jurisdiction in person, evidenced by the presence of the Pope's war flags, both federal and state, trimmed with gold fringe, just as the Pope's flag is trimmed in gold fringe. Dear truth seeker, the prince that shall come, Daniel 9:26. Being at first no more than a king of men, the last Pope of Rome, commanding the temporal and political allegiance of the Roman earth, he afterwards, in recovering from his mortal wound, claims to be divine as that man of sin, and demands the worship of apostate Protestant, apostate Orthodox, and pagan Roman Catholic Christendom. Of that coming prince, the papal Roman Caesar, being the Antichrist, we read, in his estate, Shaliana, the god of forces, Daniel 11:38, the god of war. And why? Because the organizing principle of any society is for war. The absolute authority of the state over its people resides in its war powers. And for what purpose? To what ends are these means justified? Because absolutist war waged by the Roman papal Caesar with his society Jesus destroys all religious and political liberties, so accursed by the evil Council of Trent as all heretics and liberals can be mass murdered without the interference of due process of law. Presently, in the warring Jesuit American Empire, it is called emergency war powers, which have created a monster called the National Security Agency with its hired assassins, select CIA agents, Green Berets, and Navy SEALs. By the middle of the 20th century, American Protestant and Baptist freemen would be reduced to the existence of a taxpayer. Robbed of their status by the Jesuits' 14th Amendment, every taxpayer would be subject to an inquisitional audit, arbitrary bank account seizure, or dictatorial wage levy, as every natural person would be presumed guilty of tax fraud or evasion until he proved his innocence to a hostile and prejudiced auditor. Thus, the controlling emotion between the citizen and his government would be fear. The Dominicans, like the IRS, ran the holy office of the Inquisition during the Dark Ages in the same manner, controlling the people with fear. These sweeping new powers would begin to fulfill the Jesuits' quest of submitting the United States to the temporal power of the Pope. The Jesuits' ancient enemies, the white Celtic Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle class, would be reduced to credit card poverty. Trillions of dollars would be driven to offshore banking havens, and the people would fearfully submit to the absolute powers of an inquisitional bureaucracy. By 1914, the Jesuits were now ready to begin their vengeance, the Second 30 Years' War on Europe, Russia, China, and Japan, having rightly banished the company forever from their shores. The order would use its Federal Reserve Bank, their financial Frankenstein, to pay for it. The Fed was given the exclusive privilege to create credit with no collateral, that is, out of thin air, like the Bolshevik Revolution, also financed by the Fed and backed by President Woodrow Wilson. The Jesuits would use their Masonic Jewish Zionists such as Paul Warburg, yearning to rebuild the Solomon's Temple, as the visible leaders of the Fed. This would enable the order to justify American anti-Jewish fury at a later date, in the person of ex-Basilian secret Jesuit radio priest Charles E. Coughlin, the father of hate radio. Being the personal friend of J. Edgar Hoover and FDR, he would blame the Jews for the order's Great Depression and the New Deal, calling it the Jew Deal. The Jesuit private credit was extended to the American Congress, controlled by the Jesuits' Council on Foreign Relations, to build a vast war machine with which to fight the Black Pope's Second 30 Years' War. This Jesuit war machine became 14th Amendment America's military-industrial complex. Thus, the American Empire's military-industrial complex, financed by the Federal Reserve Bank, which enslaved the American people to repay the debt from credit created out of nothing, would be directed against the Russian and German empires, the enemies of the Jesuit general and his mouthpiece, the infallible Pope. Remember, the Russian Empire was composed of Orthodox heretics accursed by the Council of Trent. The empire had expelled the order from its borders in 1820. The German Empire was composed of Lutheran heretics accursed by the Council of Trent. Likewise, that empire had expelled the order in 1872. Both empires were dead set against the Jesuits, establishing the Pope's temporal power within their borders. The Jesuits waited from 1913 to 1929 to make a virtual monopoly out of their Frankenstein Fed. The Great Depression put all the smaller banks out of business and made the Federal Reserve Bank lord of all. And who caused the Great Depression? According to FDR's son-in-law, Curtis Dahl, it was the night of Malta Joseph P. Kennedy. We read, the feeling around the street in succeeding months was that there were, in particular, 3 large short sellers of stock, allegedly Tom Bragg, Ben Smith, and Joe Kennedy. Of the 3 mentioned well-known short sellers, Joe Kennedy was allegedly the most important, the most powerful, and the most successful. This service made him invaluable. Was Joe Kennedy carefully selected by world money leaders to sell short? Indeed, for that moneylender was New York Archbishop Patrick Cardinal Hayes, controlling the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Rome, in creating the Great Depression with Joe Kennedy, enthroned its Federal Reserve System in 14th Amendment America as its international keystone to restore the Pope's temporal power around the world. The empire's privately owned central bank, created by the Jesuit generals J.P. Morgan at the Millionaires Club off of the coast of Georgia and Jekyll Island, became the master of both the northern and the southern American people while they became its slaves. But the living Son of God, to whom has been given all authority in earth, raised up a mighty voice, heard by all true statesmen in Washington. The brave Pennsylvania Congressman Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, addressed the House of Representatives on June 10, 1932 as follows: Mr. Chairman, we've been dealing with the effect of things rather than with the cause of things. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the wicked Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The iniquities of the Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve Banks acting together have cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. The Federal Reserve Banks are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves. The Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind the holy monk Colonel Edward M. House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten monarchical institution of the King's Bank to control us from the cradle to the grave. In other words, the imperial power of elasticity of the public currency is wielded exclusively by these capital corporations owned by the banks. Why should our national bank, depositors, and our government be forced to finance the munitions factories of Germany and Soviet Russia? The United States has been ransacked and pillaged. Our structures have been gutted and only the walls are left standing. This is the John Law swindle over again. The theft of Teapot Dome caused by the Knights of Malta was trifling compared to it. What king ever robbed his subjects to such an extent as the Federal Reserve Board? And the Federal Reserve Banks have robbed us. I've singled out the Federal Reserve currency for a few remarks because there has lately been some talk of a fiat money indeed. Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its power, but the truth is the Federal Reserve Board has usurped the government of the United States. It controls everything here and it controls all our foreign relations via the Pope's Council of Foreign Relations. It makes and breaks governments at will. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of the United States did not perceive that a world system was being set up here which would make the savings of an American school teacher available to a narcotic drug vendor in Macau. They did not perceive that the United States was to be lowered to the position of a coolie country which has nothing but raw materials and heavy goods for export, that Russia was destined to supply manpower, and that this country was to supply financial power to an international superstate, a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world to the Pope. Oh, dear truth seeker, the warnings of this great American went unheeded, and one terrible day, on the third attempt, Congressman McFadden was murdered, given the poison cup by the masters of the Federal Reserve Bank, those sons of Loyola, the Jesuits' infallible Pope, ruling from Solomon's rebuilt temple in labor, Zionist Jerusalem, would govern that world superstate. This is why the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Banks, storing Vatican gold, financed the overthrow of Orthodox Russia in 1917. This is why the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Bank financed Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, thereby purging Europe and Western Russia of its heretic Jews. This is why the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Bank financed the building of Stalin's Red Army, thereby purging Russia, the Baltic states, and East Germany of its heretic Protestants. This is why the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Bank financed the building of the American Empire's military-industrial complex, resulting in a mass bombing, bastardizing, and partitioning of Germany. We repeat what the Jesuits did. The American Protestant state of Virginia, they did also to white Protestant Germany. Today, William J. McDonough, member of the Jesuits' Council on Foreign Relations, along with his friend and president of the Jesuits' Fordham University, a professor of the Fourth Vow, Joseph O'Hare, who influenced the election of Michael Bloomberg, another Masonic Jewish Zionist, in becoming the mayor of New York City, is an Irish papal knight, a member of the Order's CFR and Trilateral Commission, a Jesuit-trained economist, and past president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which along with its member banks is the biggest bank in the world. With the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Bank and the 16th Amendment in place, two pillars of Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, were now active in 14th Amendment America. With the passing of the Internal Revenue Act, the IRS Business Inquisition was beginning its ultimate destruction of the white Protestant middle class, along with its private rights and wealth. Given another 100 years, the company's unhindered quest would be crowned with success. World War I could now begin. 8 months after the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, the guns of August began to roar. The Great War, the beginning of the Jesuits' Second 30 Years' War, the crusade in Europe, as pro-Masonic Eisenhower called it, was on. Payback time had arrived for the anti-Pope, anti-Jesuit Russian and German empires. To the internal disgrace of both Protestant and Baptist peoples of the West, Satan's company would use the strongly Protestant empires of America and Great Britain to punish the homeland of the greatest and most liberal of the Tsars, Alexander II, as well as the homeland of Europe's bravest hero, the Reformation's champion of the Bible, Martin Luther.